Hi, everyone. It is Monday, December the 7th, and Tuesday, December the 8th. We're here, 2 weeks left in the month before we get to our winter break. So let's keep on pressing on and getting through these last 2 weeks, and then we'll have a couple-week break here. So last week, we spent time talking about the Articles of Confederation and the first Constitution that was used here in the United States. But as we talked about, that didn't work out for various reasons. Mainly that left the federal government without much power. We talked about how the Articles of Confederation had a bunch of weaknesses, and that was shown through Shays' Rebellion. So today, we are going to be talking about the Constitutional Conventions. Let's jump over here. All right. Our title this week is Making a Constitution. So our essential question this week is, what role did compromise play in the creation of the United States Constitution? So in the summer of 1787, leaders from across the country, from all the 13 different states, met in the city of Philadelphia. So remember, Philadelphia is the center. That's where the Declaration of Independence was signed. So, the same place they met before, they decided to meet again to talk about the nation's problems that are going on. And, they agreed that there were a lot of weaknesses here with the current government. There were problems with, the Articles of Confederation, and what do we do to fix that? And there weren't just one opinion. There were multiple opinions for how to do that, and nobody could come to, a firm agreement right off the bat on how to fix the articles. So 55 delegates attended the meeting. They represent 12 of the states. The only state that didn't send any delegates was Rhode Island, but the other 12 all were there. And they included a big mix of people. You had heroes of the Revolution, like George Washington, you see there. You had older people like Ben Franklin, who by this time is a pretty old guy. He only lived a few more years after this time period. And you had some younger leaders start to come into focus as well. So George Washington was elected to convention's president. This isn't the same as how he was our first president. We'll get to that later on. But he's elected as the convention's president, meaning he's the presiding officer. He's running the convention. So here are a few of the key framers that end up playing a big role here in the framing of the Constitution. So George Washington from Virginia, he's a planter, meaning he's a plantation owner, aka also slave owner, and then famously commander of the Continental Army in the American Revolution. So probably the most widely respected individual. That's why they made him the president of the convention. He was the one person that could garner every single person's respect. James Madison, also from Virginia, another slave owner as well. He was a legislator. He had worked in the Virginia legislature, and he's a big proponent in getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and replacing them. Remember, this convention wasn't called to replace the Articles. It was actually called to revise the Articles, to fix them. But, of course, that's not what ends up happening, and James Madison's what pushes for that to happen. We talk about Ben Franklin from Pennsylvania, who was a writer, printer, inventor. He was kind of a jack of all trades, legislator, diplomat, kind of did a little bit of everything. Like I said, he was a pretty old guy by this time. But again, another individual that's pretty widely respected, a lot like Washington. Gouverneur Morris from Pennsylvania was another prominent individual, a lawyer, merchant, legislator, pretty outspoken. Another name, Alexander Hamilton. Obviously, this is pretty famous because of the popularity of the Hamilton musical, which we'll be talking about later this week as well and using in class. But from New York, he's a lawyer, legislator, and he's actually a champion of a strong central government. So, he's one of the individuals that's pushing for more power to be placed in the national government. In fact, Hamilton in different times was accused of wanting a monarchy and wanting to return to a tyrannical system like the British had. And then Roger Sherman of Connecticut, John Dickinson of Delaware, two other prominent figures that had also been big in the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So again, the purpose of the convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation, not replace them. So they were there to revise them, but some of them right from the beginning, Hamilton was one, Madison was another, had the idea that, the Articles, they can't be saved. They're not worth saving. What we need to do is just throw them away, scrap the whole system, and start from scratch. And on the third day of convention, so pretty quickly it becomes evident, a proposal is presented to just go ahead and do that. Just replace the Articles with a completely new plan of government. I don't know if you guys have been in this situation. I know I have in my career. Like, if you're ever writing a paper for a class and you get to the end and you realize, hey, this paper kind of isn't very good. What do I do? Is it easier to just, try to fix it, or is it easier to just throw the whole thing away and start over? And that's kind of what the delegates here decided to do. They decided pretty quickly it's easier just to throw the Articles away and start over. And the plan is mainly written by James Madison. James Madison is known as the father of our Constitution. Later on becomes the fourth president of the United States, but he is known as, even today, the father of the Constitution, because he's the one that actually comes up. It's not that he comes up with all the ideas on his own. I mean, he comes up with quite a bit, but he's the one that actually puts pen to paper. So the Virginia plan, there's a couple plans here for the Constitution. So the Virginia plan calls for a strong central government with three separate, distinct branches of government. One is a legislative branch, where you have a Congress that makes the laws. And remember, this was the one part that did exist under the Articles of Confederation. They want to continue that and have a Congress that has some more powers, but they can make the law. They want to add an executive branch with a president that carries out the laws, and a judicial branch, so a national or federal courts that are able to interpret the laws. So this is where we get our three branches. So we have the legislative branch, which is Congress, the executive branch is the president, and the judicial branch, which is the court system. The Virginia plan, this is where things start to separate a little bit between some of the delegates. The Virginia plan also calls for Congress to have two separate houses, an upper and a lower house. We call this a bicameral legislature. A unicameral legislature just has one house. A bicameral has two houses. So think about like a unicycle versus a bicycle. A unicycle has one wheel. Bicycle has two wheels. So the Virginia plan wants to have both this upper and lower house, and they want them, importantly, to be determined by a state's population, meaning the states that have a bigger population are going to have more seats in each of these houses. So Virginia, which during this time, Virginia was the biggest state by population. So states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York would have more seats than small states like Delaware, New Jersey during this time, or New Hampshire, which didn't have a lot of people. The small states obviously didn't like this. They said, no, that shouldn't be the way it is. They think that, every state should be equal. Even though we have a smaller population in Virginia, that doesn't mean Virginia should have a bigger say. So they argue for the unicameral legislature. They say, nope, we should just have one house. Every state should have one vote, every state equal. And this becomes known as the New Jersey plan. During this time, New Jersey was a pretty small state. Today, it's not. I mean, it's small in size, but New Jersey's got a big population today. It's actually the most densely populated state in the country today. But back then, there weren't many people in New Jersey. So New Jersey's saying, no, we need to be equal. Just one house, unicameral, and every state should just have one vote. There were some other differences in the plans too. For example, the New Jersey plan also argued that the president should just get one 6-year term. So there were some differences in the president's role as well, but the one that most people think of and that we remember is here with Congress and how it's going to be divided with power. And this issue pretty much almost tore the convention apart. The states were so far, Virginia wasn't going to budge, and Virginia and the states that agreed with them, the bigger states like Pennsylvania and New York, they're not going to budge. The small states like New Jersey and Delaware see, hey, we're going to be screwed if this happens. We're going to have basically no say if it's all based on population. So again, you have these two plans that, really there's a huge gap between them, and you're not going to be able to move either one of them. And some people thought the convention was going to collapse, that they were going to end up leaving without having any deal at all. Finally, though, Roger Sherman of Connecticut introduces a compromise, which becomes known as the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. You'll see it, depending on where you're reading, you might see it either ways. The Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise, if you see those, it means the same exact thing. And what this did was it gave each side part of what it wanted. So, again, Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise. And here's what it did. It gave the Virginia plan the two houses like they wanted, but it made representation different in them. In the House of Representatives, representation is based on population. And in the Senate, every state's equal. Every state's giving 2 representatives. So big states get 2, small states get 2. So that, and you see this difference today. You think about, the House of Representatives. We have 435 members of the House of Representatives today. 55 of those are from California. So California, which is the most populous state, they have 55. We have 7 states that only have 1. States like Alaska, Wyoming, Montana, North and South Dakota, Vermont, Delaware, all only have 1. So 55 versus 1. So you have other states like Texas and Florida that have a lot. So this is what Virginia wanted. And so Virginia got the most seats during this time. And in the Senate, every state gets 2. So even today, California, which is the most populous state, gets 2 senators. And then, a little state like Wyoming or Alaska, population-wise, gets 2 as well. Another big issue came up concerning slavery. So how are we going to handle slavery? And we understand that, a lot of the delegates here were slave owners. George Washington and James Madison right off the bat. They're both from Virginia and slaveholders. So should slaves be counted as part of a slave's population? And there was a differing of opinions here. Number one, the southern states, the delegates from the South said yes. The northern states said no. Now, why do they want to do that? Why would they want those to be either counted or not counted? So the southern delegates said yes, because they want to have more population, because if they get more population, they get more representation in the House of Representatives. The North says, hey, you have these people that you have that you're not treating as people. You're treating them as slaves and property. So no, you don't get to count them as your population. So they come up with a compromise, the 3/5 compromise. So what this said was that each enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person. And, we talk about things in our history that are bad, negative, that, we look back on with shame, like slavery and how we've treated Native Americans. This is another one where we're taking actual people and saying, nope, they're only worth 3/5 of a person. So, this was something that was written into the Constitution. So if you go back and you look at the original text of the Constitution, it's still there. It's not in the Constitution today, but if you go back and look at the actual text, it's in it. It didn't, though, the 3/5 compromise didn't do anything to address the issue of the slave trade itself. It was just about the counting of slaves as far as representation goes. So what do you do about the slave trade? Some of the northern delegates, the northern delegates that were more abolitionists, that were more anti-slavery, they wanted to completely ban the slave trade, get rid of it altogether. Southern delegates argued that would ruin their economy. You can't get rid of slavery because that's what we're depending on for our economy to run our plantations. If you get rid of the slave trade, we aren't going to be able to get new slaves, and it's going to destroy our economy in the South. So they come up with a compromise. And again, it's a compromise that, historically we look back at and without a lot of pride for it. So here's what they come up with: the slave trade compromise. Ships could keep bringing enslaved people into the country for 20 years. So 1788 to 1808. So in 1808, they weren't be allowed to bring enslaved people into the country anymore. After 1808, enslaved people could not be brought into the country. So this ends new slaves being brought over from Africa. But until 1808, people were still able to be brought into the country. After 1808, they could still trade within the country. So if you were a slave, you could still be bought and sold within the country, but it just means we're not going to be able to bring any new slaves from Africa into the United States after 1808. So when the last compromise was reached, the delegates agreed on the provisions of the new compromise. And again, this was a long process. They were there for weeks on end. This is in the heat, in the middle of the summer in Philadelphia. They were trapped basically in the Constitutional Hall, Independence Hall. They were sworn to secrecy. Of course, things did leak, but they did a pretty good job of keeping things secret, what they were working on. So Gouverneur Morris from Pennsylvania, he wrote the preamble, which identifies the source of the new government's authority in its opening words. It starts with "We the people," one of the most famous statements in American history. We'll look more at the preamble probably next week. So after weeks of debate, the delegates stepped forward, signed the Constitution. There were two different groups, though, that emerged at the time of the signing of the Constitution: the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists are people that oppose ratifying the Constitution, and some of them ended up not signing the Constitution. George Mason, Edmund Randolph, Elbridge Gerry. These were Mason and Randolph were from Virginia. Gerry's from Massachusetts. They refused to sign it. John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee, they all signed the Declaration of Independence, but at first, refused to support ratification of the new Constitution. And the people, the Anti-Federalists, the crux of their argument, and we'll talk about this. I think we're going to do an activity on Thursday and Friday with this. The crux of their argument is they were happier with the Articles of Confederation. They felt that this new Constitution gave too much power to a national government. They didn't want to have all that power with the national government. The Federalists, the people that did favor ratification and of course end up winning out, John Jay, who eventually becomes the first Justice of the Supreme Court, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, who, Hamilton and Madison are pretty instrumental in the creation of the Constitution. Madison's who actually writes it mostly. So again, the differing points of view: the Federalists, they wanted a strong national government. They wanted the three branches of government filled with men of reputation, meaning people who could carry out the duties and be respected by all. They wanted to have this president that could lead the executive branch. And they think we didn't need the Bill of Rights. They thought it was unnecessary. And this is their argument with the Bill of Rights. They said, if you need a Bill of Rights to say what the government can't do, you're saying the government has the right to do those things in the first place. And they're saying, well, the government shouldn't have the right to do those things in the first place, so we shouldn't have a Bill of Rights because of that. The Anti-Federalists say that the states should have the power, much like they had under the Articles of Confederation, that the legislative branch should be the strongest branch of the government, and they're worried that if we had a strong president, they could become a tyrant, and we could end up back in the same situation we were in with the British. And they argued that we needed to have this Bill of Rights to protect the rights of Americans. So we have the Federalist Papers, and we're going to be looking at those on Friday. They're written anonymously, but later it comes out that the people that wrote them were John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. Hamilton writes most of them. The Federalist Papers are a series of essays that try to get people to support the new Constitution. So they address the ideas of representation, the rights of individuals, majority rule. Also, they talk about judicial review that we'll talk about later on. The anti-federalists also have writings. They write to objections to the constitution of government formed by the convention, and they argue, the fear of having the strong executive branch and not having a Bill of Rights. So, the Anti-Federalists, they argue that the national government has too much power. They say the Supremacy Clause means that, the national government can, just overrule any laws that are made by the states, and it'll only be a matter of time until the state governments are destroyed. Federalists are saying, no, you don't need to worry about that we have certain procedures in the Constitution. We'll look at this more in detail in the coming weeks that are set up to, we're not going to allow states to be completely overrun by the national government. The Anti-Federalists also say that we give too much power to the executive branch. It's becoming a monarchy. Federalists say, no, we have all these powers that are split up. We're going to make sure that we don't allow this president to become a tyrant. We have checks and balances that are going to be put in place to keep one branch from becoming too powerful. And then they argue about the Bill of Rights. And I won't go over all this, but I just mentioned that a little bit ago. The Federalists are saying we don't need it because you're trying to say that the government has the right to take those things in the first place. But the Anti-Federalists are saying, no, we fought this war to prevent tyranny. We need to have this in place to protect our rights. So the Federalists do eventually, they need the support of the Anti-Federalists on the Constitution. So they agree that, okay, you can have the Bill of Rights. So they agree that this will be done. So they say, okay, if you sign off on the Constitution, we promise that we'll put a Bill of Rights on next. So they do it through the amendment process. There's a process in the Constitution to create amendments. We've had 27 amendments in American history. The first 10 are right off the bat, which are the Bill of Rights. So this was a victory for the Anti-Federalists that gave them that Bill of Rights. We'll be looking at what those are. But, we've talked about the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and all those important things that we cherish. And we talked about that before. But again, it was a victory for the Anti-Federalists to be able to get this on. So again, it was another compromise. This whole thing's about compromise between the Virginia and the New Jersey plan, the unfortunate 3/5 and slave trade compromises, and then now between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists with the Bill of Rights. All right, guys, have a great week, and we'll talk to you guys next week.